8,000 BC and went to about 1500 BC. And the transition from the Archaic period to what they call the formative period here in Utah is when agriculture started to develop within Utah. So that's kind of the temporal framework, just a quick reminder of what we did last time. So let's get, I thought it would be helpful just in case we have some new members to talk a little bit about rock art and some of the language that we use. So first of all, in my personal opinion, rock art isn't a written language. It has figures and it has meaning, and it has meaning to those who created it. One of my favorite stories was from Ben Pekovitz back when we were in the Kanab Symposium, and he was telling a story. I don't remember his exact age. He said he was 12 or 14 or something like that, and his dad said, okay, you know, you're finally old enough now that I can take you to the learning rocks. And I love that story and that language. So clearly it has meaning to him, but I don't think it's a written language in the sense that we would think of a written language. And there's a couple of terms that we use quite frequently. A pictograph is a painted image, and petroglyphs are pecked image. And tonight we'll be talking about anthropomorphs and zoomorphs. And an anthropomorph is simply something that looks like a human being. It isn't necessarily a human being. It could be a god, it could be a dead ancestor, it could be a constellation in the sky, it could be a ghost. But at least from the rock art standpoint, it looks something like a human being. And we talk about zoomorphs, and most of the time we'll just talk about them as being animals or sheep or something like that on the panel. But again, you know, different people will interpret those in different ways. So even though it looks like an animal, you know, there's a writer who interprets the Great Hunt scene in 9 Mile Canyon, and he says the sheep there aren't sheep, they're actually tribes of people who are leaving because of an external threat. So again, they look like animals, but they may not be animals. So technically we should call them zoomorphs. All right. I'm doing this because David likes to start almost all of his presentations talking about the Utah Legislative Building, our Capitol building. And he says, you know, if you look at that building and you look at the motifs, the style of the building, you would say, you know, that's kind of a Greco-Roman architecture. But you would never think that, you know, 2,000 years ago, some Greeks sailed across the ocean and came and built a building here in Salt Lake and then left. So what he talks about in art is that style is the combination of motifs that is used over and over again. And that's a great definition for style. I'm going to use a slightly different definition because an archaeologist would probably add to that. And the archaeologists are really interested in who created it using that style. And so an archaeologist, if they didn't just want to go down to the city planner's office and check the building permit, come up and they would look at that building and they would say, well, there's very little weathering deterioration, so it's not 2,000 years old, and there's concrete and there's rebar, so it's fairly new. And we know that, you know, there was a government period when a lot of government buildings were done in this kind of Greco-Roman imposing style. And, you know, that was back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so, you know, we think this is what's going on. It was a fairly modern building built for government purposes. It fits with a lot of other kind of buildings that we see of this style. So as we talk here, David's absolutely correct in talking about style from an art standpoint as being motifs, but we need to think a little bit more broadly about it when we start to think about who are creators. And so if you think about style equaling culture or a creator of an image, then we have to think more like archaeologists. Archaeologists tend to hate rock art. And the reason they do that is because it doesn't conform to their standard ways of dating and assigning cultural associations. So if you think about how archaeology do things, they like layers. And they go and they dig from the top down and they'll find a layer of a culture. and there's potsherds and there's lithics and there's fires and there's, you know, all kinds of stuff there. And they say if all of this stuff is on the same layer, it's probably all associated with the same time frame. And then they dig down further and they find another layer, and all that stuff is there together. But the rock art's sitting up on top, and it's not associated directly with any single layer, and so they don't know how to date it, and they don't know how to think about it in terms of style. And I actually had that specific discussion with Joel Janetsky, who is now a retired professor from BYU, and he was doing a dig just outside of Escalante, and he went all the way from the modern down to the Paleolithic. He just said there was layer after layer after layer after layer in there. And there was rock art up in the alcove above it that had horses in it. And he says, Troy, you know, I just don't know what to do. He says, so I called some Paiute people in because, you know, the horses indicate that it's reasonably modern, and asked them what they thought about it. He says, but, you know, other than that temporal diagnostic, you know, the rock art could have been associated with any one of the layers that we dug as we went down. So we have to start thinking a little bit more broadly to help identify that question of dating and when and who created it. So some things to start off with. We always want to start off with the motifs. That's absolutely essential. And then we start thinking about geographic location. So who has lived here in this area where we're finding the rock art? What other artifacts are associated with the rock art? And we'll find that in a lot of these styles. For example, the Glen Canyon Style V was dated because it kept finding similar pottery and similar other artifacts, surface artifacts, that were there with the styles all the time, and they could date those other artifacts and say, well, you know, if we continue to see these artifacts with this rock art, it kind of makes sense that the rock art and the artifacts are associated. And then there's relative dating, superimposition and repatination, and it doesn't give us exact dates, but for example, you know, I've never seen a Barrier Canyon panel on top of a Fremont panel. I have always seen Fremont panels on top of Barrier Canyon. And so it doesn't tell us how much older the Barrier Canyon is than the Fremont, but it tells us that Barrier Canyon is older than Fremont. And then there are temporal diagnostics. So there's things like the bow and arrow. So if you see a bow and arrow in a panel, we know from the archaeology that the bow and arrow came down here about 500 AD. So we can start to do some more dating and say, well, okay, this panel has to be 500 AD or later. And then there are cultural diagnostics. So different tribes use different things in the rock art. So for example, the Ute, once they got the horse, they went out to the plains and got really influenced by the Plains Indian culture. And the Plains Indians, they hunted the buffalo. And so you come back, and when we see the buffalo, it's almost always going to be a Ute diagnostic. So there's things like that we can use to identify different cultures within the rock art as well. So don't think in absolutes. Don't say, you know, this rock art is in a place, it's in vernal, so therefore it has to be Fremont. We're going to show you an example in a little while when Nina's talking of a Glen Canyon figure that's in vernal, and that's just a long ways away from Glen Canyon. So don't use absolutes, yes or no, but weighting, you know. So if you say, well, you know, it's highly unlikely that there would be a Glen Canyon figure here, but somebody could have come up on a trip and, you know, here's the other things that would indicate that this is Glen Canyon. And don't be dogmatic, because the styles vary over time and by region and by artist. And so if you see something and you think, oh, you know, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, you know, don't get caught up and say, you know, I saw this 200 miles away and, you know, the people said it was this kind of style, and so therefore it has to be that. All right, so here's an example. This is Newspaper Rock State Park. And if you look at this, you see all these really nice, bright, beautiful rock art symbols here on most of the panel. But I have a hard time identifying motifs for Ute imagery, which is what I think most of the imagery is here. But if you look in the very top right corner, you'll see Fremont imagery up there. You'll see an anthropomorph that has a bucket head, it has a couple of horns, it's got a trapezoidal body, and it's more heavily repatinated. So there's Fremont motifs here. The geographic location, this is an area where Glen Canyon Style V, Glen Canyon people, Barrier Canyon people, Anasazi, Ute, Navajo have all been in this area, so it could be any of those people. You know, it's a well-trafficked area. There's no surface artifacts, but if you think about from rock art standpoint, there's lots of Anasazi rock art in the immediate area. There's Barrier Canyon rock art in the area as well. And from a relative dating, that higher level of repatination in the top right corner would indicate that those are probably older figures than the stuff down below. And finally, within the Ute, there's a whole bunch of temporal diagnostics. You've got cowboys, you've got horses, you've got guns, you've got furs, bow and arrows. So there's all kinds of stuff down there that says this is later period rock art. And then you've got cultural diagnostics. You've got buffalo and bear tracks. The Utes were really interested in the bears. I mean, that's not an exclusive thing to the Ute, but they really were interested in the bear. So, you know, if I looked at this, I would combine all that stuff together, and I would say, okay, I think there's two different styles here representing different dates. You've got Fremont and you've got Ute over the majority of the panel. So that's just kind of combining all these different things that you can think about when you look at a panel. So I wish I could tell you that there was this really simple formula, you know, A plus B plus C equals this style, and there isn't. Styles change over time. You're going to have to be flexible in how you think about it. And a lot of what we'll do tonight is we'll talk about anthropomorphs in terms of style. But you're not always going to find an anthropomorph. You know, you may find a zoomorph and they may be more difficult to figure out, or you may find abstract images and they're more difficult to figure out. And so we'll do our best to give you some general guidelines, but you know, you know, there's never going to be a perfect thing where you can walk up to any panel and say, this is the group that made this panel. All right, Nina. If you click on here, this is your turn to talk.
Okay, so the first style that I wanted to talk about is Great Basin Curvilinear, and I want to begin by saying this is just based on my experience and what I have read. I've got 30 some odd years of experiencing with this, and I've done a lot of reading. But that doesn't make me an expert, and it doesn't mean that whatever I say is gospel, because it definitely isn't. It's just from, you know, what my experience is. And we, you know, almost all researchers in rock art begin with Heiser and Baumhoff, because they came along and they just did a survey of the whole, you know, Southwest and put it all into some big volumes of books, and that's where everybody took from. They had a lot of ethnography behind their research, and wherever they could get somebody to talk to them, they told them what these images meant. And that's what most researchers base their ideas of what style is. And I think it's really important to remember that this is something that these people used a style of rock art, and it wasn't necessarily their style. And you see, especially in Paiute, you see a whole lot of copying going on. You see those Paiutes are copying other people's images. And so these are done in the style of whatever it is we're talking about. So you start out with the Great Basin Curvilinear, and it seems to be the oldest rock art there is. Eckhart Malachy just got through writing a really, really good book. It's called Early Rock Art of the American West. And we will have a bibliography at some point. So we will have a bibliography of some suggested reading that you guys can take a look and see if you can sort stuff out. But his huge book covers a gigantic area where he has seen this Great Basin curvilinear all over everywhere. And from my experience, and I want to specifically talk about Utah. I'm not talking about Nevada or Arizona or any of that. I just want to confine my stuff to Utah. And most of the time, if you see a boulder that's got Great Basin curvilinear on it, you can stand there and look around and you can see that those places are really great views. They're view areas. And one of the diagnostics of Great Basin curvilinear is they will take this huge boulder and they will just cover it with images. I was reading in Sally Cole a few days ago, and she was talking about how she believes this oldest kind of rock art began, and she thought it was as you're making basketry, you have deer antler or deer leg that you sharpen up, and it helps you so you can split up those twigs into something that you can weave with. And the twig needs to be sharpened again and again and again. And she believes that it was that process of sharpening that created an image on the stone that they embellished after that. And that's how this Great Basin came to be, because it's not any kind of imagery that we could ever really even understand what it is. So, you know, they're just meandering lines, basically, is what they are. In Utah, you know, the Wasatch Front is really a defining line for it, and it's all west of I-15. And then many sites have anthropomorphic elements as this style continues to flesh itself out. They have figures from multiple time periods, and we'll go through some examples of this. And what I have seen in this Great Basin curvilinear is a really old, really wide, really deep pecking style, and then some really, really fine and deep pecking. And they're usually just totally repatinated. And in doing so, you've got different kinds of rock that repatinate in different ways. And a lot of times this Great Basin curvilinear stuff will be repatinated to the point where it's just a totally different and darker color than the parent rock is. So, and that's just a process, I guess, of exposure. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can move this thing around.
I got it for you.
Okay. Okay, so on the left here, you can see, can you see my arrow moving around?
Nope.
No, okay. So on the left, you've got this really deep, wide line that's totally repatinated. On the right, you've got something that doesn't have any patination at all to it, probably. And, you know, being on the same kind of parent rock, you can see what the process of repatination does. It just makes it darker and darker and darker as time goes by. And that's one of the ways that you can, you get your repatination. All right.
You just tell me when you want me to go forward and I'll do it for you.
Okay. This is one of those examples of the really fine lines that are really deep and totally repatinated. You can see on this that across the edge, right up above the anthropomorph, the stone has been kind of pecked out in circles, and the circles have been repatinated. And one of the things that I find with the Great Basin curvilinear here is that there are a lot of those really deep dents that don't have anything to do with an image that they're making, but they are secondary on the boulder. Go ahead. This is another example of that really weird, you know, just pecking all over the rock. And they usually just cover this rock with images, but they aren't really representational of anything. Totally repatinated, but not just, I mean, it's just like unreadable. It just makes you crazy looking at it because of, you know, you look at it from all different angles and all different ways, and it still doesn't make any sense to you. And that's one of the hallmarks of this Great Basin curvilinear rock art. Okay. Okay, these are two images that are basically in the same area, and it's because of the exposure to the weather that they have repatinated in a different way. The one on the left is where it repatinates back to its black self. The one on the right is just as old, but because it's on the other side of the mountain to begin with, but only, you know, a mile away, it's on the other side of the hill, and it's made on a different kind of rock that repatinates differently. And you can tell because of that big spall that came off of there. It's got a really light part on it, and then it's got that dark repatinated part where it wasn't pecked away, but it has repatinated in a whole different way from the gray that's around it. That one, actually, the one on the right has a couple of sheep on it. So, and the one on the left is an anthropomorph. So this is what we were talking about when you've got these people that are involved in the same thing as these crazy lines that you can't even tell what they are. This is one of Troy's favorite glyphs over here on the left. It's really hard to exactly figure out what it is, but you also see this kind of representational image to me that more looks like a fishing net than anything else, and totally repatinated again. And these are up in the Great Salt Lake area. Most of what I've seen of Great Basin curvilinear is in the Great Salt Lake area, and then it takes off in Nevada and just goes everywhere. Okay. This is another way that you, I think we put this in here so you could tell that they had just covered the rock using all the surfaces of the rock. And you know, they could have been counting something using those little dots with a line on them or something, but it's getting a little bit more, you know, more than just random. This is a place where it would have been a really good camping area, and you could have stayed here for days and days and days because it's right next to a spring. And so usually these are places that you could, you know, stay a while. Okay. This is another example of just using the whole rock. And this is you know, vertical facing up, I mean, horizontal facing up, and the repatination on it isn't as obvious, but by the pecking style and I just lost my thought. Is by the content that you can tell that it's Great Basin curvilinear. It doesn't have any real meaning to it. It's got wide, deep lines. It covers the boulder. And so those are things that tell you that it's Great Basin curvilinear. Okay. This is one of those cases where it has repatinated to a different color from the parent rock. And, you know, I guess it's just a case of what the rock is made out of that makes it look like that. But again, you see those great big wide lines that are really deep. You can see each individual peck in them, and that's a Great Basin curvilinear feature. Great. This one is in the same area, but it looks more realistic. I would still call it Great Basin curvilinear style. It looks to me like there's a person there, and it's got maybe a rope, you know, surrounding it. But that's my imagination, and maybe that isn't what it is at all. And it depends on, you know, the way you look at it. If you turn it upside down, it doesn't look like a person at all. But I think it probably is. Okay. So here's an example of out in the West Desert. It's a whole different kind of rock from up by the Great Salt Lake. And you can see that the style is pretty consistent. It's still big and deep and wide, and things that are pretty unrecognizable. It's possible that there's a handprint over there on the right side, but maybe that's just, you know, what we make of it. But still pretty identifiable as Great Basin Curvilinear. Okay. This is a case where you can see by superimposition where the Great Basin Curvilinear is. Darker and stuff that is lighter on top of it, that's more representational, that you could, you know, possibly figure out what it is that they were trying to convey, with the other stuff underneath that's less easily identifiable. One of the hallmarks of this Great Basin Curvilinear is these lines of grids like this. Another one is there's a circle that looks like a sun, a figure of a sun, where it's a rayed circle. And actually, Great Basin Curvilinear does have a lot of circles in it. Okay. Okay, in conclusion, Great Basin Curvilinear tends to fill the space that it has. It's wide and deep, or it's narrow and deep. It's beautifully done. It's not done in a hurry like some other rock art styles seem to be put on there just as fast as they could get it there. These are really done purposefully for whatever purpose that was. And actually, it's one of my favorite styles of rock art. I just love it when I find them. And especially around the Great Salt Lake area, you know, they're an hour away if you know where to look. Okay. Do you want to add anything to that, Troy?
No, that was great. Thank you. So as you can tell, Nine and I are doing a little tag team approach tonight. And so it's my turn to talk about Barrier Canyon style, which is always a scary proposition when David Sucechas on the video conference, because he's been looking at this stuff and studying it for 30 years. So the image here has been highly edited. I pick out a whole bunch of stuff that's in between the images there just so that you could see the main figures. And the definition on the right-hand side is directly from David. He talks about elongated figure proportions, so they're long and narrow and they taper down, and generally they're without limbs. They don't have arms or legs, although sometimes that will happen. And he calls these big figures like this spirit figures, and he says they're bilaterally symmetrical. And what that means, let me get my drawing tool here. So if you take this figure here, oh, that's not very dark. Can you see that line?
No.
Let me make it darker.
There you go.
So if you drew a line down the middle of the figure and you looked at what you see on the left-hand side of the line, it would be a mirror image of what you see on the right-hand side of the line. And so that's what he's talking about in terms of bilaterally symmetrical. And he talks about a parallel line motif with long vertical lines. And you can see that especially over here on that left-hand figure with just long rows of vertical lines, all parallel to each other. And also in the left-hand one, you can see round, oversized goggle eyes. And we'll see other examples of that that are even really more exaggerated. They often have shoulder bars, which I think are the kind of the darker lines on the shoulder here. And the compositions are apparently representing friendly associations with animals, birds, snakes, and plant images. And again, on that left one, there are snakes on both sides of that figure. And I'll show you lots more examples of that as we go through further images. The other interesting thing here is if you look at this image, and somebody had to point this out to me, but if you look at this right-hand image here, there's a superimposition of a Barrier Canyon figure over the top of a Barrier Canyon figure. So in here, you've got another Barrier Canyon figure and another Barrier Canyon figure superimposed over the top, which is just interesting. And then I have some personal thoughts about a Barrier Canyon style as well. I think Barrier Canyon style is the only style I know of in Utah that's what I call anthropocentric. So it's all about the big human looking figures. You get into other styles and there'll be just zoomorphs. You'll have a panel of sheep, or you'll have a panel of abstract images that we just saw in the Great Basin style. But in Barrier Canyon, it's all about the human kind of images. They're always the biggest. They always seem to be the central figures. Everything else is going on around them. And I get a little nervous when I put in words like only, but I do think that's representative only. And I'm sure tomorrow I'll have 20 emails with pictures that say this isn't representative. There's some abstract elements here as well. But I really think, you know, even though there's things that we may not understand what they are to them, that they understood what they were. And so I think this is a style that doesn't have a lot of abstract or any abstract images in it. I think it's almost purely representative. Okay, David also described 3 different types of figures within the Barrier Canyon style. And I still remember where I first was when David did this talk and I heard about this the first time. And it was just a huge aha moment to me because I had a real problem, you know, looking at a figure that's in the top left and comparing it to the figures in the bottom right and saying, how are these 2 things the same? And it was really helpful when David did this talk and he said, okay, there's composite figures, which is the one on the left, that are composed of body parts from different beings. So if you look at that figure, if you look at the feet, those are bird kind of feet. Then you've got a tail, you've got a human kind of body and human arms, you've got a sheep or a goat head, and you've got a snake tongue coming out of the mouth, and you've got a snake maybe coming down one of the arms. So it really is a composite figure made up of a whole bunch of different beings. Whereas the spirit figures down in the bottom right, if you think about that panel, you've got the 3 big figures are spirit figures, but most of the rest of the figures there are spirit figures as well. But he also talks about a different kind of a figure, the citizen figures that have the appearance of ordinary people. They have arms and legs and they're smaller in size and they're usually active. And so I've pointed out a couple of those in that panel. And it's interesting that both of those citizen figures in this panel, I think they're not looking directly at you. They're facing sideways, which I think is, what is it? It's not portrait, it's landscape, I guess. And that happens really infrequently with anthropomorphs. And I think the reason for that is that we like to look at anthropomorphic figures face on because we recognize people by their faces. And so I think it's interesting when we have rock art where people are facing sideways. I think there's something unique about that. So 3 different types of figures, and you can find this paper within our URARA publications if you're interested in reading more about it. So I thought I would start this section of the Barrier Canyon with this image for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is the rock art site that was the very first rock art site that I saw in Utah, and it's the one that really got me interested in rock art, and so it's here for sentimental reasons. Secondly, it's here because we've got some superimposition again. So you see this figure here is a Barrier Canyon figure, and it's superimposed by a painted Fremont figure. And so again, the Fremont's on top. The superimposition is a relative dating, and what that means is that we know that one thing is older and one thing is newer, but we don't know how much older or newer the two are. So it could be that the Fremont figure was painted one day after the Barrier Canyon figure, or it could be that the Fremont figure was painted 1,000 years after the Barrier Canyon figure. We don't know. It's just that we know one is newer and one is younger. The other interesting thing that I thought I would just show you here is the dog in the left, and the beautiful detail that's in the tail of this dog. I came to this site once with a fellow named Jim Blazik, who was a National Park Service ranger, and I asked him to define the Barrier Canyon style for me. And he said, you know, my definition of Barrier Canyon is attention to detail, which was a really interesting, it was not the answer that I expected. But if you look in there, you can see every tail or every hair on the tail of that dog. And then the dog is interesting because that's an uncommon element. I think it's a canine. I don't really know that for sure, but I think it's a canine there. And as we go forward, here's the Cleopatra site, and there's another canine, I think, in this picture as well. Beautiful Barrier Canyon figure. And then we're down at another site with another canine in the middle and Barrier Canyon elements surrounding it. So just some other Barrier Canyon figures. Again, this showing the long, narrow body style, wider at the shoulders, narrower at the bottom. These ones have arms and legs. And I think that they've been ritually obliterated. So you'll notice that most of the figures there have the paint removed from the chest or from part of their body. My guess is that that was done for ritual purposes, although I don't know exactly why. And you'll notice that the one in the center, the third one from the left, has bird feet. You see snakes in here. Again, you know, all these kind of interesting elements that Barrier Canyon seems to have. The same panel, again, really long, narrow, tapering body styles here. We've got snakes all over the place, and I'm going to show you some additional detail. Well, look at the little teeny tiny sheep. They're about the size of your thumbnail up in the top, and these birds flying up and down in between the figures, and a larger bird over here on the right. Just exquisitely executed panel. I threw this one in because it's my favorite picture with a snake, and there's snakes in a lot of the Barrier Canyon imagery, but look at that snake. It looks like it's dripping venom, and it's also horned, which is unusual. Well, it's not unusual in Barrier Canyon, but we see a lot of horned snakes in the rock art here in Utah, and I don't know why that is. And it also looks like it has arms, which is interesting. We have a plant figure to the left of this large image. We have smaller citizen figures, I think, down in the bottom right. We've got this bird figure over to the left. And the other thing to look at is this central anthropomorph here. It has what I'd call kind of a rake style body, where again, it's using that parallel line motif, but it's doing it in a way where they're just coming down in straight lines. And you'll see that a lot in Barrier Canyon, where the Barrier Canyon figures just have kind of rakes coming down of lines. The body hasn't been filled in. Beautiful image. Again, another snake here, plants on both sides, some kind of an animal figure off to the left. And at the same site, more Barrier Canyon. So on the left, we talked about the big goggle eyes, and this is a great example of those on the left-hand side. And then on the right, it looks like you've got plants coming out of the head and birds flying around. And I really wonder about the spiral in the body of this figure, if it was intentionally created by the Barrier Canyon people or if it's a subsequent addition by a later culture. This is one of the most famous sites in Utah, and David has an interesting commentary on this site. So this is called the Holy Ghost panel in the Great Gallery site. And he talks about the figure here on the right-hand side. And again, he made a really thoughtful comment about this. And he says, you know, when you look at it, it almost looks like it was a mistake, that it was put in a place where it shouldn't have been, and therefore they had to make it too small. And he says, but he wonders if they were actually trying to create a three-dimensional view, that this figure was actually further back inside the rock than the other figures were, and therefore would appear smaller from a three-dimensional standpoint. And that this whole panel was kind of trying to demonstrate figures actually coming out of the rock, which I think is a wonderful interpretation. Just some more details. So this figure on the left, again from the Great Gallery, it's hard to see anything up there in the chest, but if you look on the right with a de-stretched image, you can see you've got sheep coming from the bottom, going to the left, coming up, and exiting out the body to the right. You know, again, fantastic level of detail within the imagery. Sago Canyon, again, big goggle eyes, snakes everywhere, beautiful images. And that's Barrier Canyon style. And now we're going to switch back to Nina and talk about Glen Canyon Style V.
Okay, so Glen Canyon Style 5, there's a pretty large time period difference between that Great Basin Curvilinear and Glen Canyon Style 5. This is still really, really old stuff, but it's not as old as the Great Basin Curvilinear. And it was first identified by Christy Turner in 1963 in his monograph, which is Petrographs of the Glen Canyon region. And that was done as part of that Glen Canyon survey before they put in the dam. And he noticed as he was going through the rock art photos that there was a definite difference in time periods of when this rock art was put on the rocks. And so he gave these different time periods numbers. And Glen Canyon Style 5 is the oldest. Glen Canyon Style 1 is historic. And so Glen Canyon Style 5 is kind of stuck with this stuff from his time period on through. There's some common things with these images. One of them is in the humans, they have circular heads. They have a lot of these images are like what I call ant people, where they have these big long antennas. They could, Sally Cole was thinking that they could be representations of the first masks, which, you know, morphed into kachinas. So I don't disagree with her at all. The eyes and mouths are round, the bodies are stick figures, or they can be, you know, 5 feet tall. And they are done in an outline with just interior lines in them, and they're very, very rarely pegged solidly. And the zoomorphs are going to be square, usually square, sometimes round, like a boat body, but they have the same interior lines, and they could be gridded up, or they can be just going very either horizontal or vertical. But they have unusually really short legs and tiny little heads for their body size, and that's those identifying things of Glen Canyon Style 5. Some other things that I've noticed in the Glen Canyon Style 5 that don't have to do with anthropomorphs or zoomorphs is the really long, wavy or straight line that'll go 10, 15, 20 yards. That's supposed to be the Glen Canyon 5, an identifying factor in those. There's also all kinds of rows of dots, and they're a patterned row. They aren't just random. They'll be like a wavy row of dots or a straight row of dots, but they're done purposefully. They aren't just, you know, random. And the other thing I noticed about Glen Canyon 5 too is you can see in this figure off to the right, it looks like just these random little tiny peckings. And I see that quite often in the Glen Canyon 5 style. It's like they made these images and then they shot their arrows at it or something. So that's really pretty common in the Glen Canyon 5 style. Okay.
Okay, Nina, before we go, Nina really likes to find pictures of faces and things like that in rock surfaces. So if you look at the crack on the right, do you see the two faces with people kissing each other there?
Yeah, they're everywhere. I'm ready for the next photo.
There's just a little delay between when I click and you see.
Okay. So it looks like this is a drawing from Ann Phillips. I haven't seen this before, so I'm just going to go over it with you. You know, these scratches that they've got across the bodies, nobody's ever been able to tell how old they are or what culture they came with, but you see it a lot with Glen Canyon. And, you know, who knows, but you will see that quite often. That's really a good drawing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is another Ann Phillips, and this is just a row of anthros, it looks like. And then there's some of those like ladder-like things, some little wavy lines down there, and some sheep images that have the interior lines in them. There's a lot of those boat-bodied sheep too, where they've got a really round body, and that's pretty common in Glen Canyon 5. You can see that they use a real fine line when they pack their images, really, really fine line. And I would expect that it's not as deep as the really nice archaic stuff, but I haven't ever looked at it really, really close. You'll see that Glen Canyon 5 is usually really well repatinated. This is along the river where it just gets a lot of sand and stuff blown into it, and so they kind of have a tendency to just kind of fall apart. Okay. So this is your superimposition lesson, where you've got Glen Canyon Style 5, where Troy has squared those off so you can see them more clearly. And then you've got your basket maker images that are over the top of the Glen Canyon 5 in, you know, more places than he's even got showing here. And even the images that they're making in the basket maker are just totally different from what you've got underneath the Glen Canyon 5 images. And so as you get more learned about what you're looking at, you can tell just by the image that they're making how old it is. In a lot of times you can tell just by the image itself whether it's Glen Canyon 5 or basket maker or what. Okay. This is another superimposition case where you've got this sheep that's right over the top of the Glen Canyon 5. You've got one up top that's even newer than the one that's down on the bottom. And I'm not sure that this is just a case of where the rock is, how it weathers out. It's not as old. You see the pendant necklace looking things that are up on top. That's kind of common too. So here we are down by a river and going into a canyon that gets a lot of exposure, but not a lot of sand blowing over it or any of those kind of things. And it's really almost straight up and down. And so your repatination is going to be different, but you can see even on this boulder that the images on the left aren't as repatinated as the ones on the right are. And you can also see that in this Glen Canyon Style V, you've got all these circles and circles inside of circles, concentric circles. You got some animals. Some of them have great big long legs, and I think that's another identifying feature of the Glen Canyon 5 is these animals with really long legs that don't have feet. They just have legs. Okay. I apologize for this and that it's so out of focus, but it was way, 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 way up there. This is, to me, it's kind of a cool, I can do this figure in so many different ways kind of thing. I don't know what it is that they were trying to prove when they did this. The figure that's on the right is so unidentifiable. You can't even tell, really what it is. It looks to me like some kind of an enclosure or something. And then you've got your central anthropomorph that's got the rows of dots, and the one on the left that's got those big long lines, and that's your identifiers for the Glen Canyon Style V. Is they're a lot of times they just don't have arms at all. Sometimes they have little tiny arms, and the legs are pretty disproportionate to the rest of them. Okay. This is an example of those rows of dots that are purposeful that I was talking about, where they're using, in this case, they're using there's no head on this, so I'm not going to call it an anthropomorph. I would rather call it a weaving or something like that. I don't know exactly what it is, but you can see that those dots aren't from a shotgun or anything like that. They were purposefully made and repatinated to the same extent as the lines that were made are. And so these happen to be inside an image, but a lot of times they are outside of the image. Okay. Here's your sheep. These don't have the interior lines on them, but you can see the great big square bodies, the tiny little heads, and the tiny little legs. And a lot of the times with the Glen Canyon 5, these animals look like they're running, or they're they're showing some signs of movement. They aren't just static, just standing there not doing anything. They're going somewhere. You can see that these animals are headed somewhere. Okay. This is one that's all gridded up, and to the left of that you can see this purposeful line that comes down, and it's not just random pecking, although there is random pecking in between them, but this is just one of those instances where you've got a body it doesn't seem to be very well made to me, but it's done in the style of Glen Canyon 5. Okay. I don't even know what to say about this one. It's got a sheep that is really, really weathered out, that's got the beautiful gridded body in it. Another one to the left of it, right by that crack on the left, and then another one to the right of it with a great big long neck. But these things weather out pretty badly. You can see other images that I believe were probably made at the same time. Of that big starburst, whatever it is, thing that's in the center there. Okay. This is really, really hard to see. It's such a shame. I just get heartsick every time I see this panel. You've got beautiful, beautiful spirals. This is over more towards the eastern part of the state instead of in the west. And you've got these great big long wavy lines that go clear across the panel, several of them. And that's one of the hallmarks of the Glen Canyon 5 style, is these wavy lines, and sometimes they're straight lines, and most of the time they're a wavy line that just runs all the way across the panel. Okay. This to me looks almost like a map, but I don't know whether it is or not. It's becoming more narrative than random. One of the ways of determining a Glen Canyon Style 5 panel as well is that they don't make use of the whole space. They just put on there is like whatever they needed to say, they say it and then they leave. They don't tend to cover up the whole panel with images like other styles do. But to me, this looks like a map. Okay.
All right, so just a few last thoughts. So for me, when I started out with URARA, you know, I started by asking everybody, what does this panel mean? And I quickly learned that I never got an answer to that question. So I stopped asking it. And then the second question I asked everybody was, what style is this? And everybody would give me a sour face because it can be really, really hard. I mean, you look at some of these pictures and it's not easy to determine style. But I think that developing expertise and identifying style is, for me at least, it's personally satisfying, and I think it's helpful for us professionally. For example, I was in a Zoom presentation on Wednesday with an archaeologist who put up a panel and said, you know, here's this nice Fremont panel, and it was actually a Ute panel, you know, so I put a little notification in chat. And I think our brains are pattern-seeking engines, and they'll often assign a classification quickly and arbitrarily. You know, some people think that 80% of all the decisions we make are made invisibly to us. And I think it's important for us to really look closely at panels, to look at the details, and to really think about what we're seeing there in order to determine style, in order to determine the culture that created it and the implications of the panel. Think about the broader context. What kinds of things are we seeing? Temporal diagnostics there? Are we seeing cultural diagnostics? Are we seeing high levels of repatination or less levels of repatination? And finally, just as a, when I've been doing, I have read more articles on more different things in the last month than I can even count. And when we get into the rock art material and I'm doing Google searches on stuff, I come back to the URARA publications page a lot. That's where Google sends me. We have great material within our own archives. And people should be taking a look at that if you really have some interest in this. So that's the end of this presentation. Our next presentation, we will be looking at the Fremont and the Anasazi style rock art. I don't know exactly when that is. It'll be a week or two, and we'll send out a note and let you guys know. Otherwise, I think, Werner, we're open for questions and general discussion.
Okay, thanks, Troy. Thanks, Nina. That was great. We got a few questions on the chat, which I thought I would go over first. Jan asked, how do you know it's a dog? I think when you were talking about the Barrier Canyon style dog and the tail.
Well, that's a great question. I don't really know it's a dog. It's my guess. If you see something like that, it's large, and it's like that, it's either a cougar, which I don't think they would have within kind of their family group, or it's a canine. And so I I think it's a canine. I think if you're going to have something within a family grouping, it's something that's going to be nice.
And then another question, this had to do, I think, when you were showing the Barrier Canyon style superimposed by a Fremont figure, and Jeff wanted to know why you were calling it a Fremont figure.
Oh, well, we'll talk a lot more about that in the next presentation. So we'll do Fremont and we'll do Anasazi in the next one. But the Fremont have a couple of stylistic things. So they have what we call an upside down bucket style head, and the bucket's often narrow towards the neck, and that one had that perfectly. And it has broad shouldered and a trapezoidal body where it narrows as it goes down, and it'll often flare out again at the waist. So that was a really nice Fremont figure. And then in association with the panel, a little bit up and to the left, and I didn't show you that picture, there's a beautiful Fremont figure it's had about 20 bullet holes in it. But so the Fremont were there, and that was, anyway, we'll talk more about the Fremont in a week or two.
And then the last chat one was a comment by Kirk Ashtroff. He says, we need to stop talking about repatination. When petroglyphs are made, they are incised into base rocks so they varnish. Patination is an outmoded term, and recent research indicates that varnishing on petroglyphs differs by groove depth and width. There are methods for measuring varnish color, particularly by RGB means through digital photography, light meter reflection radios, and spectrometers. Readings of varnish. Varnish formation is also influenced by aspects, compass orientation, and location, horizontal or vertical, or overhangs.
Yeah. So I tried to explain that in more lay terms. You know, how it varnishes differently on one side of the mountain than it does on the other side. But I think the reason that we use repatination is because that's what's on the site forms when we record them.
And it is a great comment. And where I learned about this was at one of the sites that we showed you in the pictures. And there was a boulder with that Great Basin Curvilinear, and it started on one side of the boulder and it went over to the other side of the boulder that was facing in a different direction. And the one side of the boulder, the Curvilinear was completely repatinated, and the other side it was not repatinated at all. So when you're looking at repatination, you have to be very, very careful. So for example, it works quite well in places like Indian Creek at Newspaper Rock State Park, because that's the same facing direction and a relatively flat panel. And so different degrees of repatination works here, but you have to be really, really careful about inferences that you make with repatination.
All right, so that's all the chat stuff. So I'm just going to unmute everybody, and if anybody has a question, chime in. We'll see what happens.
Nina, I have a question.
Okay.
When you use that I-15,
yeah,
you're leaving out Severe Valley for barrier or for Great Basin, Curvilinear, and Severe Valley has lots of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would just dip Severe Valley into that.
So are you talking Severe Valley that's over there by, you know, Mount Pleasant in that area, or are you talking about the Severe Valley that's over there in the Great by Delta?
Richfield. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Fremont Indian State Park plus the valley where Richfield is, there's a lot of Curvilinear stuff.
Okay. I appreciate that. It was more of a general statement.
Right, sure. And then I had a question on since the barrier is older and the Curvilinear is older, is Salina Canyon a boundary between Curvilinear and the barrier style? Where would you put the boundaries on that?
a boundary is just a general term
Right.
where you see
Right,
more of
for
it here than you
example.
see it there. And, I've seen Glen Canyon 5 stuff clear up on the Utah-Idaho border, but that doesn't mean that that's where it's from.
Yeah.
And so you just kind of I was just generally speaking. If you're
Yeah.
talking about the majority of the petroglyphs that are in the Sevier Valley, they are Fremont.
Yes, but they're also, but I'm talking about the Archaic period.
Okay.
In my area, the Archaic period is definitely Great Basin Curvilinear. Where does that boundary start where you start seeing the Barrier Canyon stuff?
They overlap, Jeff, they overlap.
Okay.
We have figures in the Barrier Canyon style, western Nevada or eastern Nevada, and Colorado and southern Wyoming and northern Arizona. They overlap with almost every style in the area.
So what about in Utah?
Well,
In Utah, in general, Barrier Canyon in Utah, you're going to see on the eastern side of the Wasatch, up into the San Rafael and down south towards the Blues, the Abajos.
Okay. All
That's
right.
that's the major density in Utah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That makes sense.
Any more questions? Comments? Group chat? All right, well, thanks, Troy. Thanks, Nina. And stay tuned. We'll let you know when the next presentation is coming up. Troy said maybe a few weeks, maybe early June, something like that. And we'll try to do maybe like 2 a month for a while, and we'll have some more coming up. So watch.
Yeah, very interesting. Very great information. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Doing it.
Great
We
job.
really
Thank you.
Thank you.